Clara May stood in the dark barn with a lantern shaking in her hand, while Elias Boone aimed his rifle at the locked door. Outside, someone was dragging a shovel through the mud. Then a man's voice called from the rain, "Hand over the girl, Boone. She was never meant to become your bride. She was meant to be buried with the secret she carried." Clara's blood went cold. Only 1 hour earlier, Elias had hated the sight of her. He had called her a liar in front of the whole train station. He had refused to marry her before half the town. But now he was standing between her and death. And in Clara's pocket was the letter that proved the dead had not finished speaking. Before we begin, tell me where you are listening from today. If this story touches your heart, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you have ever been rejected, misunderstood, or judged before the truth came out, share your experience too. Someone reading your words may need that strength. The train came into Mercy Creek, Texas, under a sky the color of old tin. Clara May stepped down from the passenger car with 1 brown suitcase, 1 worn Bible, and 6 letters tied together with blue ribbon. Dust rolled across the wooden platform. A church bell rang somewhere beyond the saloon roofs. Horses snorted near the hitching rail. She looked for the man from the letters. Elias Boone, he had written kindly. He had told her about his ranch, his widowed mother, and the long silence in his house since his younger brother died. He had said he wanted a wife who understood hardship and did not scare easy. Clara did understand hardship. Back in Missouri, she had buried her mother, lost her teaching position, and watched her uncle drink away the last of their savings. So when the first letter came, signed Elias Boone, she believed God had opened a door. Then she saw him. Elias stood near the freight wagon, tall, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. His face was handsome but hard, like a man carved by wind and grief. Clara smiled weakly and walked toward him. "Mr. Boone?" Elias looked at her suitcase, then at her face. His eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The question struck her like a slap. "I'm Clara May Whitfield," she said. "I came from Missouri. You sent for me." The people on the platform turned. A few cowboys stopped loading crates. The station clerk leaned out his window. Elias took 1 slow step back. "I sent for no woman." Clara's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. "You wrote me for 6 months." "I did not." Her cheeks burned. She reached into her coat and pulled out the bundle of letters. "These are yours." Elias did not take them. "I know my own hand," he said coldly, "and I know my own mind. I never asked you to come here, and I sure never asked you to marry me." A woman near the platform gasped. Someone laughed under his breath. Clara felt every eye on her. "Please," she whispered, "do not shame me like this. I left everything." Elias's jaw moved, but his voice stayed hard. "Then someone has played you false, but it was not me." A man in a black coat stepped from beside the station wall. He had silver hair, clean boots, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Now, Elias," he said, "no need to be cruel. Poor girl looks half dead from travel." Elias glanced at him. "Stay out of this, Mr. Voss." Clara noticed the name made the air tighten. Mr. Voss tipped his hat to her. "Silas Voss, ma'am. I own the bank in Mercy Creek. If you need help buying a ticket back, I may be able to arrange credit." The word credit sounded kind, but Clara heard the chain inside it. "I have no money," she admitted. Elias looked away, as if her shame troubled him more than he wanted to show. The station clerk cleared his throat. "Next train east. Don't come till Tuesday." Tuesday? It was Friday. Clara looked down at her dusty boots. 3 days in a strange town. No money, no family, no husband. Then thunder rolled. By evening, rain struck Mercy Creek so hard the streets turned to black mud. The boarding house was full because cattlemen were passing through. The church door was locked. Clara sat beneath the station, awning with her suitcase beside her, trying not to cry. A wagon stopped in front of her. Elias sat on the bench, rain dripping from his hat. "My mother heard what happened," he said. "She says no decent woman sleeps at a train station in a storm." Clara lifted her chin. "And what do you say?" "I say one night, in the spare room, at sunup, I bring you back to town." She should have refused. But lightning flashed and the world looked empty. So Clara climbed into the wagon. The Boone Ranch sat 3 miles out, past broken fences, wet grass, and cattle standing like shadows in the rain. The house was old, but strong, with lantern light in the windows and a porch that creaked under Elias's boots. Inside, Ruth Boone waited by the stove. She was thin, gray-haired, and tired-eyed. When she saw Clara, her face changed. Not with surprise, with fear. "You look like her," Ruth whispered. Clara froze. "Like who?" Ruth glanced at Elias, then looked down. "No one. Come warm yourself." Elias noticed, so did Clara. Later, while Ruth made coffee, Clara stood near the fire and pulled the wet letters from her pocket. One slipped loose and fell open on the floor. Elias bent to pick it up. The moment he saw the handwriting, all color left his face. "Where did you get this?" "I told you," Clara said. "You wrote it." Elias shook his head slowly. "No." His voice dropped. "This is not my hand." He held the letter closer to the lantern. "This is my brother's." The room went silent except for the rain tapping the windows. Clara swallowed. "Your brother?" Elias looked at her as if the ground had opened beneath them both. "My brother Thomas has been dead for 2 years." Then Ruth Boone let out a small cry behind them, and from outside, beyond the rain and dark glass, a horse whinnied in terror. Someone had opened the ranch gate. Elias moved before Clara could breathe. He grabbed the rifle from above the door and stepped toward the porch. Rain blew into the room when he opened it. The lantern behind him threw his shadow long across the wooden floor. "Stay inside," he said. Clara did not move. Outside, the ranch gate banged in the wind. One of the horses screamed again, sharp and afraid. Ruth Boone stood near the stove with one hand pressed to her chest, her face pale as flour. "Elias," Ruth whispered, "don't go out alone." But he was already gone. Clara stood frozen, the letter still open in her hand. Thomas Boone's handwriting stared back at her. The words that had once made her feel chosen now made her feel hunted. "My dear Clara, if you come to Mercy Creek, ask for Elias Boone. He is a hard man, but not a cruel one. Trust him when the truth begins to hurt." Clara had read that line many times on the train. She had thought it was romantic. Now it sounded like a warning. Ruth noticed the fear on Clara's face. "Child," she said softly, "where did those letters truly come from?" Clara's eyes filled, but she fought the tears back. "They came to my uncle's boarding house in Missouri, always by post, always signed Elias Boone." Her voice broke. "I believed them. I believed every word." Ruth took a slow step closer. "And your mother's name?" Clara looked up. "Margaret Whitfield." Ruth shut her eyes. The name hurt her. Clara saw it plainly. "You knew her," Clara said. Ruth did not answer fast enough. Outside, Elias shouted, "Who's there?" No one answered. Then came the sound of hoofbeats racing away through the mud. A moment later, Elias returned, soaked and angry. His boots left dark prints across the floor. "Someone cut the side gate," he said. "Spooked the horses, then ran." Ruth gripped the back of a chair. Elias looked from his mother to Clara. "What are you not saying?" Ruth's lips trembled. For a long moment, she looked like a woman standing before a grave she had tried to forget. "Margaret Whitfield came through Mercy Creek 25 years ago," Ruth said, "before you boys were born proper enough to remember trouble. She worked at the old mission school near Dry Creek." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "My mother never spoke of Texas. She had reason not to." Elias stepped closer. "Mother." Ruth looked at him with wet eyes. "Your father helped her leave." The room went silent. Elias stared at her. "My father?" Ruth nodded slowly. "There was a land deed, a claim near the south pasture. It belonged to Margaret's family by right. Silas Voss wanted it even then." Clara felt cold all over. "Mr. Voss? The banker?" "Yes," Ruth said. "He was younger then, but already greedy. Your mother had proof that Voss cheated her father out of land. She came to Mercy Creek to fight it. Then she disappeared after a fire at the records office." Clara shook her head. "No, my mother died poor. She never owned land. She may not have known what remained," Ruth said. "Or she may have hidden it to keep you alive." Elias looked at the letter again. His face changed from anger to pain. "Thomas knew?" Ruth covered her mouth. Elias's voice sharpened. "Mother, did Thomas know?" Ruth nodded once. "He found something in your father's old trunk, a copy of a deed, a letter from Margaret. He thought Clara might be the rightful heir to the south pasture." Clara's knees weakened. The south pasture was not just land. She had heard Elias mention it at the station when Mr. Voss spoke. It was the part of the Boone Ranch with water running beneath it, the only part still strong enough to keep cattle alive through a dry year. Elias turned away, pain twisting his face. "All this time," he said, "I thought Thomas died chasing cards and whiskey in Abilene." Ruth began to cry quietly. "He was trying to help this girl," she said. He was trying to undo what your father was too afraid to finish. Clara looked at Elias, and the shame between them changed into something heavier. I did not come here to steal from you, she said. Elias looked at her. His eyes were tired now, not cruel. I know. That was the first kind thing he had said to her. Then a hard knock struck the door. 3 times. Elias raised the rifle. A voice called from outside. Boone, open up. Sheriff's business. Elias did not move. Clara's heart started pounding. Ruth whispered, "That is not the sheriff." The knock came again, louder. Then a folded paper slid under the door. Elias picked it up and opened it near the lantern. There were only 7 words written inside. Give us Clara, or Ruth Boone dies tonight. Elias read the note twice. Give us Clara, or Ruth Boone dies tonight. For the first time since Clara had met him, his hands shook. Ruth stood by the stove, small and silent, as if the past had finally walked through her door wearing muddy boots. Clara looked at the paper, then at Elias. I can go, she whispered. If this is because of me, I can walk out there. Elias turned sharply. No. You do not even know me. I know enough. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of regret. I shamed you at that station. I let my pride speak before my heart had a chance. I will not hand you to men who hide behind threats. Another knock struck the door. Then Silas Voss's voice came through the rain. Boone, this does not need to turn bloody. Send the girl out. She has no place here. Elias lifted the rifle, but Ruth reached for his arm. Wait, she said. She moved toward the old wall shelf and took down the family Bible. Her fingers trembled as she opened the back cover. From inside, she pulled a small strip of cloth wrapped around a rusted key. I promised Thomas I would only use this if Clara came, Ruth said. Elias stared at her. You knew she would come? Ruth wept then. Not loudly. Just the tired crying of a mother who had buried too much. Thomas wrote those letters before he died. He gave them to old Mr. Haskell at the post office and told him to mail them if anything happened to him. But Haskell died last winter, and his niece found the bundle. That is why they only started coming 6 months ago. Clara pressed one hand to her mouth. Thomas had not lied. He had reached for her from the grave. Ruth placed the key in Elias's palm. He hid the real deed in the barn, beneath the loose plank by your father's saddle chest. Outside, Voss shouted, Last warning, Boone. Elias looked at Clara. Can you ride? I can stay on a horse, she said, though fear nearly stole her voice. Good. He opened the back door, and they ran through the rain. The barn was dark except for the lantern Elias carried. Horses shifted in their stalls, nervous from the storm. Elias found the old saddle chest and tore up the loose plank beneath it. Inside was a tin box. He unlocked it. There lay a folded deed, Thomas's last letter, and a blood-stained sheriff's badge. Elias stopped breathing. The badge belonged to his father. Ruth cried out behind him. Thomas's letter was short. Elias, if you find this, forgive me. Father did not die from fever. He was killed because he refused to sign Boone land over to Silas Voss. Margaret Whitfield's family owned the South Water by right, and father helped hide the proof. Voss killed him for it. I found the deed. If I die too, find Clara. She is the last blood heir. Do not hate her for what truth may cost you. Elias folded the letter slowly. Pain bent his face. All his life, he had hated his brother for dying foolishly. But Thomas had died trying to save them all. Then the barn door burst open. Silas Voss stepped in with 2 armed men behind him. Rain and lantern light made his face look older, meaner, and desperate. Put the box down, Voss said. Elias raised his rifle. Voss smiled sadly. You think I wanted this? Your father ruined me first. That South Water would have made Mercy Creek grow. Instead, he hid it for a woman who ran away. Clara stepped forward, holding the deed against her chest. My mother ran because men like you made truth dangerous. Voss's eyes hardened. You are just a poor girl with a paper. No, Clara said, voice shaking but clear. I am Margaret Whitfield's daughter, and I will not be buried with my mother's truth. One of Voss's men lowered his gun. The other looked uneasy. Elias saw it and spoke fast. You men want to hang for murder over a land deed? Walk away. For a moment, only Rain spoke. Then one man backed out. The second followed. Voss stood alone. His power left him little by little. By morning, the real sheriff rode out with 3 townsmen and took Silas Voss in. Not because justice came easy, but because the deed, the badge, and Thomas's letter gave the town no place to hide from the truth. Clara did not marry Elias that week. She did something braver. She claimed the South pasture, then signed half its water rights back to the Boone Ranch for $1 and a promise. The promise was simple. No one would ever use land, money, or family name to bury the truth again. Months passed. Fences were mended. Cattle returned to the green wash near Dry Creek. Ruth placed flowers on Thomas's grave every Sunday. Elias stood beside her, no longer ashamed to cry. And Clara stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in her life, someone asked her to stay without owning her. One evening, Elias found her on the porch reading the first letter again. "I was cruel to you," he said. Clara smiled softly. "Yes, you were." He lowered his head. "Can a man be forgiven for one bad day?" Clara looked toward the pasture, where the sunset turned the grass gold. "One bad day, yes," she said, "but not without earning the next good one." Elias smiled for the first time, and in Clara's hand, the old letter no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a door, the kind that only opens after sorrow has done its work. The end.